Okay, today I'll be talking about Mina's Matchbox by Yoko Ogawa, translated by Snyder. So as always, I will start with why I chose this book, and then get into a brief plot summary, and then a recommendation, and then pros and cons, and then a final warning, and then the themes. So why did I choose this book? Yoko Ogawa, along with Hiromi Kawakami, Sayuka Murata, and Hiroko Oyamada, all kind of joined together for me in this sort of, I don't know if it's first wave, second wave, third wave, whatever, but a certain wave of translated Japanese fiction, specifically by female authors, that all gained sort of notoriety and attention. With Yoko Ogawa, it was with the professor and it was the professor and something. But anyway, the professor, yeah. Anyway, with Hiromi Kawakami, it was Strange Weather in Tokyo, or something about a briefcase. I don't know. I know it was different in the UK. And then Convenience Store Woman, of course, and then The Factory. So the thing that all these writers have in common for me is that they all write shorter books and novels, and I always find that I enjoy their novels, but they never really become my favorites, and it sucks because I always want to enjoy them more than I do, because I love Japanese translated fiction. It makes no difference to me, like, whether a man or a woman wrote it. I feel like I have to say that because I do wish there was more male translated Japanese literature, and specifically literature, because, as I say every time, I'm aware that in crime and cozy fiction there's quite a bit of male translated literature, but in terms books, but in terms of literature specifically, it's primarily dominated by women. But even then, Natsuo Kirino I really like, Mieko Kawakami I really like, and I've said Banana Yoshimoto I really like. So it's not like a sex thing, it's just in particular this group of 4 women, and I'm sure there's maybe more that I'm not quite remembering. I've just never quite resonated with their books. But that said, I have read the overwhelming majority of them, including all of Yoko Ogawa's work except The Memory Police. When it comes to The Memory Police, I actually started reading it and found that I really... if you watch my video on dystopias, you know I don't care much for dystopias. So when it started and I saw that it was going to be a dystopia, and I got flashbacks to 1984, and I was just like, I'm done. I'm so tired of 1984. I'm so sick of that book. I'm so sick of so many things about that book and its kind and whatnot. So I just stopped reading the book, and I actually ended up donating it to the library. But then later on, I discovered that actually it was less an actual literal dystopia and authoritarian police, and more of a metaphor for dementia. And I haven't had a chance to reread the book because it was between either The Memory Police or Mina's Matchbox, her latest book, and rather than take a gamble on potentially being wrong, I decided to go ahead and give Mina's Matchbox a try, even though it too is about it's things that I just don't usually care much for in reading fiction. So in terms of who I would recommend this book to, it's actually I'll go ahead and just do the recommendation now. Would I recommend it? Yes, to the people that I'm about to say, which are things that people who enjoy the things that I typically don't like. So I typically don't like books with children characters, because I like my characters to have agency in their lives, and children are inevitably limited in the amount of agency that they can exert. So even if you have more complex themes, it's always, when you have a child protagonist, through the eyes of an observer or somebody with limited agency, and I don't care much for that. Nor do I really care a whole lot for stories about childhood friendship, just because, again, it comes back to don't really care much about children. I'm more interested in adults and how adults deal with things, and the more complicated aspects of living adult life. But If you enjoy if you enjoy if you enjoy stories about children, if you enjoy stories about childhood friendship, in this case specifically between two young girls, and also another thing that I don't really care for are stories about like the one special year abroad that sort of always exists in your memory. And so again, if you enjoy that type of story, or those elements are things that really appeal to you, then check this book out. Because even as somebody who doesn't usually particularly care much for those themes, I still found it a very enjoyable and well-written book in spite of that. And I think you'll kind of just fly through the book's 280 pages, especially if this is something that you really enjoy. So to reinforce what I was going on about in terms of pros and cons and things I don't care for, plot summary. The book follows Tomoko, who's only 13, and the book is set in 1972, and she lives in one place. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but her mother is, she's fairly low income in her background, and her mother is going to work in Tokyo, or rather going to school in Tokyo. It's like a 1-year program, and because the costs in Tokyo are so much higher, they decide that it would be better for Tomoko to go and live with her aunt and uncle, who are fantastically wealthy, live in a very large, basically mansion, and I don't mean this in the Japanese term, but in the English term, in Ashiya, which is a coastal town. And it's about her 1 year in Ashiya, where she makes friends with the family's daughter, whose name is Mina, who is kind of a sickly girl, which is another trope I don't much care for, but if you're into it, then there you go. And she's 1 year younger than Tomoko, and sort of the stuff that they get up to, and it's sort of slightly episodic. And the family, you have the uncle who's dandy and makes everybody laugh, but has his own problems. The aunt has her own problems. Like, everybody's got sort of these deeper conflicts going on in what seems like on the surface something fairly perfect. But I would never say that it's a book that goes like particularly dark. It's realistic without being dour. Because the thing with portrayals of realism is that you can go realistic in a dark way, and you can go realistic in a less dark way, because the reality is things don't always end up worst case scenario, nor do things always end up best case scenario. So that leaves a lot of ground to sort of oscillate, or not oscillate, but for authors to pick which route they go without necessarily being unrealistic. But that said, it is from the perspective of a child, so there is an air of heightened realism about everything, which is most manifest in the fact that the family has a pygmy hippo named Pochiko, who plays sort of a big part in the book because she's a friend to Tomoko and Mina. So I've already said I would recommend it to people who kind of enjoy that type of thing. And if this summary has in any way interested you in the book, then by all means go out and give it a read. Like I said, even as somebody who traditionally would not read this type of book, I found the reading experience very pleasurable, even if I didn't particularly come away from it sort of feeling like this sort of crazy emotional resonance that I did coming off of like Colorless Skuru last time. So moving on to the pros and cons, where there's going to be sort of mild spoilers. Pros, I think it's very well written. Again, I don't know how much to attribute that to the translator. I don't know who translated Yoko Ogawa's other works, so it's difficult for me to make that comparison, because sometimes, well, almost every time, there's the translator's voice that mingles with the author's voice. So when you have some of these authors, like I mentioned with Banana Yoshimoto, where you have different translators, it can be somewhat difficult to parse the author's voice over a series of books from the translator's voice. But regardless, this translation, in terms of just reading it straight in the English with no context of faithfulness or anything like that, reads very smoothly, and the prose is very enjoyable. The chapters are very short. and the book itself is not very long, which leads to a very quick and sort of breezy read, which for a lot of people will be a pro, especially if you have limited time. And in particular, lately, circumstances of my life have caused me to be very busy, and I have found it very easy to come home and read 2 or 3 chapters when I don't have the time and then just head to bed. Or if I have more time, read 50 pages and then go to bed. So in that sense, lots of very easy book to read. I also really like the characters. I think they're all well fleshed out. And like I said, it does a good job of capturing the sort of duality, the way that things aren't always as they seem on the surface, without going into melodrama or quite brushing over things. It's very obvious, and this is what I mean when I say, like, I don't really care much for child protagonists, but as an adult reading a child protagonist, it's going to be very obvious to you the amount of sort of pain and conflict in this family that the protagonist themselves, being a child, is not, Tomoko is not able to understand or process, but she is able to process that something is wrong with some of these people. So the way it balances the drama without getting into melodrama, but it doesn't sort of glide over it or go for quite like a happily ever after or everything's okay in spite of it. Like some of these people, you can really dislike them if you want for their behavior, because it does have a genuinely negative effect on the people around them. So in that sense, I really have to give the book credit for that. And again, along with the short chapters, the pacing is also really, really good. Again, it's almost episodic in the way that for a little bit they'll be focused on basketball. You'll get some details about when she goes to school for the first time, and it's a big event. Towards the end of the book, you have Christmas, and that's a big event. So in that sense, just as, you know, something's ending, and again with the short chapters, it's very easy to sort of get into that rhythm of like, well, I want to see what's going to happen next and sort of start peeking ahead. And the plot is very conducive to that. Something's always happening. So again, well paced for the type of book it is. I think the characters are fairly well drawn. I think the prose is fairly well done. So in terms of cons, I really feel like my biggest con with the book is just the ending. And even then, I don't necessarily know if I would want it to be different, just in the sense that one of the things about these sort of books or stories that take place over the course of a year is that, you know, you kind of have like your summertime, and then your autumn time, and then your winter time, and then your springtime, and each time feels very unique because you know that you only get to experience it once. So like there's summer, and everything's hot outside, but everybody's outside playing at summer vacation, blah, blah, blah. And once that's over, it's not just that, well, until next summer, because you know that the character's only going to be there in that one place in that one time, and it sort of imbues it with a sense of importance. So the book kind of goes from summer, there's not really much in autumn, to winter, and it covers these two things, summer and winter, kind of in detail. Or to put it another way, using more of the Japanese style school system, you kind of have the first semester, and then up until summer break takes a pretty sizable part. Then you have the second semester, and then finally the third semester is completely sort of rushed through. From Christmas to graduation, or when she moves back to her hometown, is covered in the space of 10 to 20 pages. If even. So if you're looking for a more like spaced out thing, you know, like every single part has its equal weight given to it, which is what I kind of tend to prefer, then it will be a little bit disappointing, because it kind of feels like everything's going up at a certain clip until Christmas, and then Christmas happens, and then we rush very quickly through the last few semesters, and then or through the last semester, and then it's over, book done, bye. Which, again, just I'm hesitant to call it a con because everything that kind of happens around Christmas gives what is ultimately an episodic book somewhat of a climax, which personally I don't think you necessarily need that like high octane action climax, but this book has its version of it. But I think it could have just as well have been spaced out a little bit more, had that last part a little bit more developed, gone to like 320 pages, a full 320 pages instead of the 280 that it is. But I also think that in terms of the pacing that is there, in terms of the story being told by Christmas time, I think it's pretty much told everything that it wants to say. So I also, like, it's a con, but it's not a con that I would really like strongly knock it for. It's more like a personal thing. And otherwise, I don't have much to say about it in terms of cons. It feels weird to try and make a con out of things that ultimately I don't think the book handles anything really overly badly. It's just not quite my type of book. So this is the last chance to sort of bow out before full spoilers into themes. So obviously, if the book sounds interesting to you, please check it out. But okay, going into themes now. A major theme of the book is not quite death itself, but sort of the way that things continue to live on after they end, be it memories or be it sort of the way that people live on and matter lives on. So what do I mean by that? Well, the whole story is told as a flashback. This is Tomoko's flashback, and she mentions multiple times how important these memories are to her, in the way that when she conjures these memories, they become alive to her again. They become like new again. And she won't even go back to the place. She does in the end, ultimately. But for a long time, she won't even go back to the place where the house used to be. And this is because she doesn't want anything to risk damaging those memories. So again, you have like the memories of that time are kind of the proof to her that all this sort of existed and happened, even though the time itself is ended. In a sense, the time has died. And this is reflected again in Mina's final story in the Matchbox, which has to do with a girl who catches stars and collects dead things under her bed, until she eventually realizes that all the things that she collects under the bed that are decaying never fully decay, never fully erode, never fully collapse into nothingness and vanish. And this is obviously a sort of reflection of Mina's own ill health, her own concerns that she will not live to be to go on to become older, which personally I think, and this may be obvious, it may be conjecture, but I also think it's reflected in her interest in these matchboxes and in matches. I think she feels a kinship in matches because matches burn bright and then they burn to the tip and then they burn out, but you always have that ash tip left over. So for Mina, again, it's not just death that she's sort of obsessed with, but it's the idea of what happens after death and what we leave behind. And I think that's why she collects. To me, that's the significance of her collecting the matchboxes under her bed and writing these stories about them. Because once you're done with a match, like I said, there's the limited lifespan of the match itself. But then usually you get the matchbox and it's usually something you just throw away. But she collects them and she writes stories about them. And in this way, she sort of preserves them and gives them life. And further, a third prong of this, and of course it's reinforced multiple ways throughout the book, but I think the third major prong of this is in Pochiko, and the way that Pochiko is such a central figure throughout the story, and then Pochiko dies, and towards the very end, and actually right at the end, when Tomoko does go back, the final line in the book gives reference to a tree that is growing on the gravestone where she was buried, a tree that is suggested to be from Liberia, which is where Pochiko is from. So, you have the zoo, the ruins of the zoo, the corpses of the animals in the zoo, and then finally Pochiko herself dies. But from that death, from these other deaths, births new life. So even though things come to an end, whether they be time or the end of a life, ultimately it's about the things that grow from that death and how things pass on and continue forward. I guess even romance to a certain extent, because both Tomoko and Mina experience kind of their first crushes. Mina's being on the man from Wednesday who brings her the matchboxes, which ultimately, with him getting married and moving, this is the end of her relationship, but it also gives her the strength to stop collecting the matchboxes and to start looking forward and taking command of her own life, which is also reinforced in Pochiko's death, where she stops riding Pochiko to work, literally riding on the back of another, and is able to walk on her own two legs and is able to recover from her asthma and actually go on to live a long life, and is no longer quite so focused on these matches and burning bright for a short amount of time. And in fact, in the end of the book, there are letters between the two. And I don't know if it's a theme or not. Well, okay, I will say another thing that thematically ties the book is sort of multiculturalism between the German grandmother and the rest of the family, and the way that the past trauma, I guess that's another type of ending, actually, now that I think about it, just to go back to the four-prong endings thing. You have this German grandmother who had her twin, and she leaves her twin to go move to Japan with her husband, and then the twin is in Germany and dies during World War II. She's taken to Nazi death camp, and the whole family is exterminated there. But even though there's the end of that relationship with her twin, the grandmother and Yoneda-san, the housekeeper, forge a new relationship, forge a bond. And while it's not a one-to-one replacement for a twin, they become sort of the equivalent. I want to say blood brothers, but blood sisters, I guess, would be the right word. Blood sisters. And one relationship ends, another begins. Again, how do you continue to keep that memory, and what arises or comes from it and as a consequence of it? But I also just appreciate the fact that it's a German grandmother coming to America, so it's also got that sort of culture isn't the biggest deciding factor in the world. It's sort of it's a human thing, a human connection. But going back to what I was saying that I enjoyed so much about the way that it handles the drama of the book, the fact that the uncle is cheating on his family, and the way that you do see the consequences in the aunt, and that it drives her to drink, and the way that the house is notably happier when he's there. Meanwhile, in his absence, people are quieter and less active and less willing to engage with one another. When you read the back, I should also mention that when his son visits from Switzerland, his son doesn't write letters to his father. His son doesn't speak to his father. It's very obvious that his son is aware of his father's infidelity and won't talk to him about it. But the back of my book, the very last line is Mina's Matchbox is an evocative snapshot of a moment frozen in time, and a striking depiction of a family on the edge of collapse. And when you read that, it makes you think that the book is going to be about the collapse of this family. But that's actually not the case. And in fact, while they do sell, and this is what I mean by kind of, it's not necessarily happily ever after, but it's not full dark melodrama either. They do sell the beverage company that they own. They do sell the mansion that they live in, and it does get paved down and rebuilt into something else. But at the same time, there is no messy divorce. There's no come to God moment that we ever see in the story. And after the letters between Mina and Tomoko that bookend the novel, well, not bookend, just at the end of the novel, they talk about how the uncle and the aunt are still together at the end of the book, how the son visits with his family for the uncle's 77th birthday party. So even though there are problems, and even though, this is kind of the problem with the back of the book, is that this was written by a marketer and not the author. So even if you take the marketer saying it's a family on the edge of collapse, it's not a family that collapses. And I don't know that it's really safe to say, or really accurate to call it a family on the edge of collapse. It's a family that has its problems. And could those problems, and they're problems that began before the story began, and have since widened, but they're not to the point where they couldn't reverse. They couldn't, they could continue widening. They could reverse. It's not necessarily a family on the edge of collapse. It's a family that has problems, and every family has problems, and they might not be this severe. But I think that it's also more realistic to portray it as a family with problems, but to not necessarily have those problems be the kind of dominating end-all, be-all. Like I said, I keep using the phrase melodrama, but there are definitely ways of handling it without melodrama. But it's nice to see something that takes that more neutral road, where they're just problems. They have their own ways to deal with it. They're not healthy ways of dealing with it. But in the end, everybody still has a certain degree of love and compassion, and they find their own way of making it work. Again, what happens between 1972, when Tomoko stays there, and the 30 to 40 years down the line, when she's talking about their current present, that's a long time. There could have been a come to Jesus moment. They could have divorced for a while and gotten back together. You don't know. And that's kind of fine. The fact that they're still together at the end, or the fact that they came back together at the end, either way, it definitely suggests that there's, or rather, the way that the novel is written suggests something more than just an easy, they fought and then they went their separate ways, or a happy family where the only thing that goes wrong is maybe the uncle grabs a drink every once in a while, or something like that. So I appreciate that. I think that it's well handled, this sort of theme of family life and the imperfections in family life and the way that people kind of cope with it. In a way, it's kind of interesting because it's not an ending. Rather, it's just another phase in an ongoing relationship, which ends up persisting one way or the other. So that's ultimately Mina's Matchbox. An interesting little book. And if there's one thing I can say about Yoko Ogawa, it's that she does write well. It might not necessarily, most of her books might not necessarily be the type of things that stick with me forever, but she is a very talented writer, and I respect her for that. And I don't want to say I hope one day that she releases something that gels more with me, because I want creators to create what they want to create and not necessarily tailor everything to me, because I like it when creatives are able to express themselves. So until next time, take care.